Hey YouTube, coming at you today with a post about planning a tank setup and mistakes and how those mistakes can affect how your tank goes. Now, this tank is a 110-gallon oceanic. I've had this tank for 26 years. The tank was purchased in Dallas, Texas. It's been moved 4 times. When I went dry in the hobby and got rid of most of my tanks about 5-6 years ago, I had just bought an L260 Pleco, was the last fish that I bought before I went dry. And it went into a tank and disappeared, and I never saw it again. And I'm assuming that it starved to death because at the time I didn't realize they were carnivores. And I was probably feeding it just algae tablets. So, all the time I was dry, I kept thinking about L260s. I really enjoyed the fish. I've seen zebras. I've seen a lot of the L's that have come out. But that fish really captivated my attention and my desire to breed it. So, off and on while I was dry, I was thinking about setting up this 110 for a breeding project for L260. My wife has just retired recently. I'm on disability. So I started talking to my wife about letting me set this tank up. She's fully aware of the cost and the expense of running a fish tank. And she agreed. She is the one that said, I'm tired of this house being full of fish tanks 5 or 6 years ago. And I donated most of my tanks to a local fish club. And I hung on to 3 tanks. A 20 long, which is my quarantine tank now. A 55, which if something happens with this tank will probably have to be set up quickly to house my fish. And this 110. This 110's in a bedroom. It's not a quote display tank, but it is sort of a display tank. So, I did as much research as I could do online, and I decided that despite my old aversion to sand, that L260s probably needed some sand. That sand and rocks and a little driftwood and a few plants were in the areas where these fish are from in the Rio Tapos. So I knew I needed some plants in the tank for nitrate, and it also puts fish at ease to have plants to swim in and around and hide in. But all the reference pictures and videos that I could find of the Rio Tapos underwater showed almost no plants. Now, they are from a clear water, fast water section of the river. It's almost rapids. And that makes sense because loricarbs have the sucker mouth and can stick to rocks. So they're probably safer in that area. So I knew I needed to have a lot of rocks in the tank to give them natural seeming areas. When I first started to set this tank up, I had to clean it. It had been sitting 5 years, covered up. And I had used it many, many years before that. Now, I've always had a canister filter on the right-hand side of the tank spraying straight across and hitting the front of the tank. I've always preferred this as a methodology to aerate the water and to create a natural flow. So I knew I was going to continue to use that filter. I've had scale built up for a lot of years, but this has never been a display tank. It's never been a show tank. So I wasn't too concerned with it, and when I started cleaning this tank, I went to work trying to scrape the scale off. I despise adding any kind of chemicals to one of my fish tanks that's going to house fish. Everything that I could find said use barkeeper's Fred. It will remove scale. But I just could not bring myself to put that kind of chemical in my tank, even though I would wash and clean and dispose of the water. I just did not want to do it. So my second choice was vinegar and razor blade. Now, I'm on disability. I have frozen shoulder, not to mention spine problems. I scraped this tank for 2 weeks. Softened it with vinegar first and then scraped. Softened it with vinegar and then scraped. Wiping it out continuously. There is still a ton of scale on this tank. I'm sorry. I never dreamed in my wildest dreams that this tank would be on YouTube. It was only once I was back in the frame of mind of running a fish tank that I started searching YouTube for videos on people that were running tanks and realized that I could do this as well because I was going to set up a tank. I knew I needed sand. I've always hated sand because of the problems of it quickly becoming sulfuric bacteria, anaerobic sulfuric bacteria underneath. I'm pretty old school in my methodology. I have always used under gravel filters. Now I know they're a huge no-no anymore, and even more so because I decided to heavily gravel with a plant substrata and then 2 inches of gravel over top of that, on top of an under gravel filter, and then plant it, and then run it as an under gravel filter. Now, under gravel filters pull water through the gravel. Plants are not usually happiest when there is water flowing past their roots, but there's almost 6 inches of gravel there. So I felt like I could get away with planting and having the under gravel filter pull water through the edges, and in bare places in the middle there's a driftwood log in there that's bare underneath it, and I'm sure that it collects detritus, and it's really hard for me to get my siphon hose down inside of it to clean it. So 1/3 of this tank is under gravel filter with plants on top of it. That was my design. I had originally put 2 inches of sand on the whole rest of the tank and then stacked my rock work up on top of that. Almost immediately I realized that mistake. I knew that I was going to have to pull every rock out of the fish tank every month to clean that sand under those rocks. So I had used Texas Holy Rock that I had built up over years of fish keeping and kept. and driftwood that I had built up over years of fish keeping in Kent. I realized too late that the holy rock, which I had assumed was so covered by patina that it wouldn't leach into the water, was immediately stripped by my L260s when they were first introduced to the tank. And so I was getting heavy calcification out of that holy rock back into my water. Now, L260s come from water that is very low in calcium, very low in total dissolved solids. So I had immediately created a problem there. So I thought about it, and I decided that I would remove half the sand from this end of the tank and put an inch of styrofoam down to match the sand in the back of the tank, 8 inches wide, and stack my rock work up on it. So I went and bought 80 pounds of inert rock work and built up the wall that you see in the back on top of that styrofoam. My problem came when I realized that most of my L260s were inside of the holy rock, that I was probably not going to be able to get them out of the small holes in the holy rock, and so I left it in the tank. So, mistake one was not getting enough scale off of my tank to use it as a U-tube example. 2, probably the under gravel filter with plants on top of it is going to come back to bite me in the ass. But it's working so far. 3, sand underneath the whole other part of the tank, including the rock work. Now, this problem with the total dissolved solids in the tank. My tap water is over 600 total dissolved solids coming out of the tap. 7.5 pH and total dissolved solids over 600. That's not a great water quality for South Americans. It's great for Africans, but I don't keep Africans. So, as I got a total dissolved solid meter, I began to realize that I had made the mistake of thinking that I was going to be able to use my tap water. So I looked into RO water and realized that with a mixture of tap and RO, I could get down around 300 and keep my pH from sliding from 7.2 to 6.8 by constantly adding a little tap water, maybe a gallon at a time. So I'm doing 35 gallons of RO water change a week. I probably should be doing 50%, but it's a lot of work for me to try to tote RO water in 5-gallon buckets from the fish store to here. I haven't broken down and bought an RO unit yet because I can't honestly figure out yet what I'm going to do with the wastewater. Once I do and I convince my wife to allow me to get one, then that's what I'll probably do. But the mistake of adding calcareous Texas holy rock to the tank to begin with has turned out to be an interesting problem because I add my RO water to the tank, the total dissolved solids drops under 300, then the calcareous rock pushes it back up to about 300 again. Now, my plant substrata has a lot of minerals in it too, and originally I was running it on a power head, and I could not get the TDS to budge no matter what I did. So I switched it up and put a saltwater wood air stone in and ran it on an air pump. And that seemed to reduce the total dissolved solids in the tank to a level that was manageable. Another mistake that I made, I should have resealed the seals on this tank. I should have scraped them out and re-caulked the corners and the bottom of the tank. I did not do this. I was so impressed with the fact that it held water after 20-something years, and I was in such a greedy desire to be a fish keeper once again that I did not do this. That will probably be my worst mistake that I have made with this, planning this tank. With the aid of a flashlight, you can see the styrofoam on the back half of the left-hand side of my tank. It creates somewhat of an issue because detritus does collect behind my rockwork wall, but it's worked out pretty well. When I do a water change, I'm able to throw a couple of gallons in at the aiming down the back side of the tank, and it pushes most of the detritus out, which I can then siphon back up. Now there's been some other issues with this tank. I had a really hard time getting it to cycle like I'm used to a tank cycling. This tank fogged 3 times on me. It never really cycled like I'm used to a tank cycling. When I got done cleaning it and I set it up and it held water amazingly, I let it run for 2 weeks, waiting for it to cycle. Now, it was a dry start. I had no bacteria on anything that I could put in this tank. Now, I bought some Safe Start and added it to the tank, but I never got the cloudy appearance of a complete bioload that I was expecting. I just got minor fogs 3 times. One when I first started the tank, when I let it run and added some food. 2 when I wasn't happy with my result and I added the Safe Start to try to get the biological filter going more. And 3 when I added fish. When I added fish, I added 2 lemon tetras. I had done my research trying to figure out what the fish were in the tank, in the river that I could add to this tank. Now, it was obvious to me from pictures of the exact locality of the Rio Tapajos that there were bricons, there were some sort of pencil fish, and a lot of lorcards. Not many cichlids. Hard as I've tried to match cichlids with this tank, because I've always kept cichlids and I want cichlids in this tank, but I also want my L260 fry, if I get any, to survive. I don't want them predated on by large cichlids that will beat them to food, for one, and predate on the fry. So the only cichlids that I'm probably going to be able to add to this tank are teleochillas, which are micro predators, and there is a Satanoperkia autesiceps 4-spot Satan that comes from the Rio Tapajos, which gets 4 or 5 inches, but is also a micropredator and mostly sifts sand for microorganisms. They're not able to swallow much more than a mosquito larva or a little insect. Probably tetra eggs, but not L260 eggs, and hopefully not L260 fry. I learned my lesson with jumping the gun and buying my 6 L260s before the tank had really reached maturity. Now, one of the mistakes that I made in this tank to begin with was I did not, even though I thought I did, I really did not have enough filtration on this tank. So, I had another Fluval 404 and I added it to this tank, hoping to mature the tank and create a water quality that was pristine enough for these fish to survive in, because they're very picky about their water. The filtration I have on this tank is a Fluval 404 on the right end of the tank that has half of its output splashing straight across the tank to the front wall, and the other half goes through 2 bio wheels. I've always really liked bio wheels. I know some people hate them, think they're useless, but I've always gotten a pretty good result out of bio wheels. I've got a very large hang-on back filter on this side of the tank. It puts a really nice straight flow out into the tank, right across my pleco caves. But I decided that it was probably prudent to add my other Fluval 404 to this end of the tank to add flow and to help the bacteria load be strong enough to handle really extremely good water quality. Now, I had to put a sponge filter on the bottom of this input because it's over sand. And every time I vacuumed the sand, it was trying to suck sand up into the filter itself, which everybody knows will kill a filter. So, this tank has been a mixture of planning and mistakes and realizing those mistakes and trying to correct them and adding things to try to modify the setup to make it right for the fish. I've got a flow device on this end of the tank which puts out a really nice heavy flow which gives me a lot of surface agitation on this end of the tank. It bounces off the front of the tank, bounces off the flow, bounces off the front of the tank, off the back of the tank, and makes a circle at the far end where the undergravel filter output and the bio-wheel output and the flow from the canister output hits the wall. It creates a circular flow in my tank which steadily pushes detritus towards the filter's intakes and creates a flow across the front of the caves that I've added to this tank, along with the rock work, which they seem to be desirous to be in anyway. So, on the whole, I'm not unhappy with how my tank has turned out. It's been sort of difficult to keep up with, but not too bad since I just got the one tank. There were a lot of mistakes I made in the planning phase. I would urge anyone that is in the process of planning a tank setup to rethink that setup over and over and over again, and to try to avoid some of the mistakes that I've made in this tank. I'm pretty sure you're not going to be able to avoid all of them. That's called fish keeping. But you can eliminate as many mistakes as possible in the planning stages of a tank to save yourself trouble later on. Do your research. I researched the fish that were in the area. The best that I could come up with was that lemon tetras were from a part of the Rio Tapajos, much closer to the Amazon than the area where the L260s come from, but close enough that I felt like that they would be a good tetra to add to this tank. I wanted fish that were not going to predate the eggs of my L260s nor predate the fry. And lemon tetras are tiny fish. They're not that big of a fish. So I assumed that they would be a good addition. I found some Beckfortii pencilfish, and I've always really admired them. And I felt like even though they're not specifically from the area of the Rio Tapajos where these loricards come from, that they would be a match as far as adding them to the tank. So I got 6 of them and put them in. I got 15 lemon tetras and put them in because I wanted a whole shoal of tetras. Now, when I ordered my Beckfortii, they were supposed to send me 10, and then they told me that they didn't have 10. So they only had 7. So I got them to send me the 7, and I noticed that they had reed tetras. And they are a very tiny bricon that closely matches some of the bricons that I've seen in reference pictures of the Rio Tapajos. So I got 6 of them and added them too. I'm really happy with my fish selection, but I've discovered that lemon tetras are almost like cichlids in their behavior when they are the dominant fish in the tank. They will take most of the food. They have started defending territories. They're mating for me. I've got fry in this tank. If you look really carefully, you can see one of the tiniest ones right there, if the picture quality is clear enough for you to see. But there are several lemon tetra fry that have survived being predated after the eggs were scattered. Adding lemon tetras may have been a mistake. I don't know that enough food is getting to the bottom for my L260s to eat. They rarely come out in the daytime. They are starting to come out more than they did before. So they're obviously getting comfortable with the tank. But the lemon tetras are voracious eaters. Now, the tank has gotten mature enough for me to probably add some sort of cichlid to the tank. I'm assuming when I add teleochillas to the tank, which aren't very big and are micropredators, but will be big enough to maybe cow the lemon tetras from feeling like they are the dominating force in the tank, that maybe more food will get to the bottom because the lemon tetras will be nervous about swimming around where these cichlids are. If I add Satinoperchias, I'm sure that they will be much cowed in their behavior because the Satinoperchias will go 4 or 5 inches, even though they are micropredators. So, my point of this post is to be very meticulous with your planning before you set up a tank. I've done all this work. My greed, because I found L260s online for a really good price, threw my thinking out of whack. Instead of resealing the tank and waiting another month to get the tank seasoned and then buying the fish, I had already added the water to the tank and it held amazingly, and I went ahead and purchased my fish. Don't let the desire to have your dream fish in a tank for you to look at outweigh the needed planning to set a tank up from scratch. Good luck, YouTube.